Good evening, everyone. What a pleasure it is to welcome back Andrew Child and Lee Child in the 26th Jack Reacher book, Better Off Dead. Now, you probably don't need an introduction to either author if you're watching this, but I do have a few things to say. Andrew, wonderful Andrew, who has been here for all 9 of his books written as Andrew Child, is now actually writing as Andrew Grant. I mixed it up. Is now writing as Andrew Child, which leads me to ask Lee, and I know the answer because it was contained in the Reacher Guide, a wonderful biography of Lee by Heather Martin, and we did a conversation for that last year. Lee, since you're obviously really a Grant, or he couldn't be Andrew Grant, how did you come to choose Lee Child as a pen name? I just love the story.
It is, and tangentially about this story, I knew this is when I first knew Andrew would be a writer. All writers' households have got just insane word games continuously. And the anecdote about Andrew was when his first daughter was born as a little baby, she would be sort of fussing and squalling and all of that. And her face would go red. And of course, because she had not much hair, her entire head went red. And Andrew was calling her Brian. And I thought this guy is definitely going to be a writer because it was the sort of word game that you play. Brian Redhead was a very famous political radio presenter in Britain. And so to naturally call a baby with a red face Brian was so obvious. And the anecdote that you're talking about was a long time ago now, 1974, I think it was. I was in New York with Jane, who at that point was my girlfriend, now my wife. And we went to the theater on Broadway, and her parents lived a little ways out of town. So we got the last train from Grand Central. And it was crowded, obviously, being the last train. So we couldn't sit together. I sat next to some random guy who started talking to me. And he heard that my accent was foreign, obviously. And then, apropos of nothing, said, I've got a European car. And I said, really? What car have you got? And back then in the 70s, Renault of France sold cars in the US. And the little compact that in Europe was called the Renault 5. In the US, it was called Le Car, in order to give it a Parisian chic that would make it saleable. But the guy mispronounced it. I said, what car have you got? And he said, I've got Lee car. And so from that moment onwards, just like Brian and the baby, from that moment onward, every definite article was Lee. Lee this, Lee that. And when our daughter was born, she was Lee baby, obviously. And then as she grew a little older, she was Lee Child. And so when it was time to start being a writer, I always change my name, whatever project I'm doing. It's just an old sort of showbiz habit. A lot of the time we were contracted to something, and if you wanted to moonlight, it was not really frowned upon, but you had to observe the niceties by changing your name at least. And so I thought, well, I've got a new career now, I'd need a new name. And Lee Child seemed such a sweet and sentimental choice to me. But crucially, it was early in the alphabet, which is really, really important, or it was when I started anyway in the 90s with physical bookstores where you browse from left to right. And customers would get bored early, fatigued early. So if you were, A was no good because it tended to be knee level carrying on from some other genre or section. And so B, C, D were the key letters. And a fantastic number of sales were to authors beginning with the letter C in the 90s. So that's why I was convinced to go with it.
I love it. So for those of you who are wondering why Andrew Grant is now Andrew Child to keep the series going, now you have your answer. So I went to my own bookshelf and I pulled out my signed first edition of Killing Floor because Lee was at the Poison Pen to sign this book. And in fact, for the next 15 books, which is wonderful. And Lee, I looked up the biography just for fun, and what it says is Killing Floor is Lee Child's first novel, a former television writer. He lives in Cumbria, England, where he is at work on his second novel. Now, You know, saying that you were in Cumbria to describe an author who is writing what has recently been described, and I agree with this, as a postmodern gunfighter in a classic Western, riding a bus or hitching a ride rather than a horse into town, right there says something really, I think, fascinating. So what we have is really Shane, Jack Reacher, behaving as Shane. You have to be as old as I am to know what that means, but you have a guy that rides into town, cleans up the town, rides out of town. And yet both of you are British, both of you are from Birmingham. And now, interestingly enough, both of you spend at least part of your time in the American Wild West. So do you feel like the whole thing has been sort of self-fulfilling? Did you ever expect, Andrew, did you ever expect to be living in Wyoming?
Well, you know, Barbara, that's a great question. And it's actually almost impossible to answer because, you know, a lot of people back in England say to me, did you ever imagine living anywhere like that? And I have to say no, because I never even knew there was anywhere like this. You know, we grew up in a place that was very cramped. You know, you always had this feeling that where if you were walking down the sidewalk, if you were in a building, even if you were in a house, you were crushed in. It was small and cramped. And so the first time I came to Wyoming, I felt something I'd never experienced before, this just feeling of space, of openness, of almost like a weight being lifted off your shoulder. Just pure, it just felt peaceful, relaxing, and I just knew instantly that I wanted to live here. So, you know, fortunately, when you have a job where you can work at home, it was a thing that was possible to do. But you know, light years, centuries away from anything I could ever have imagined when I was a little kid growing up in England.
It just cracks me up, Lee. I think of you as such an urban creature. It's really hard for me to see you in cowboy boots strolling around on the Western Plains.
Yeah, and but you know that the Shane parallel that you just said is really multi-layered actually, because obviously Shane was written about Wyoming, the range wars in Wyoming. But crucially, the guy that wrote it, Schaefer, I think his name was, or Schaffer, or however you say it, he was a East Coast guy who had never been further west than Cleveland. And so he was writing that Shane story purely out of imagination and out of what he knew or what he could sense or feel about the West, and never having seen it. So when I was writing Killing Floor in Cumbria, England, which is a sort of northern, very rural, beautiful county, but not populated and generally very rural, I was imagining Georgia, USA, in the same way that Schaefer had been imagining Wyoming. But yeah, Wyoming for me is just the antidote to New York, and it is so dramatically the opposite. Because when I go out to Wyoming, I'm typically there for several months at a time. And then if I come back to New York, I usually get in late, about midnight. And what I do is I go out to the grocery to get my breakfast for the next morning. And the grocery is 1 block away. And in that 1 block at midnight, I will see more people than I've seen in the last 3 months. So the contrast is fantastic for me. You know, the insane density and energy in New York versus Wyoming, where literally you got to go out of your way to see another person. You know, it's not that they're coming at you. You've actually got to go find them.
I think your common story is really fabulous. I mean, if you were a writer of fiction, you probably couldn't really make it up. I do recommend The Reacher Guy by Heather Martin if you want to know more about Lee. But we're here to talk about Better Off Dead. And Patrick Milliken of our staff is lurking for 2 reasons. One, well, Patrick, you tell them about what you're going to be doing, and then let's show the video that your publisher created, because it will lead us into a conversation here about Better Off Dead.
Sure, yeah. Well, this is one of the first times we're streaming live on Facebook and YouTube at the same time, which is kind of cool. So everybody watching, I'll be monitoring the comments field. So if you have questions for Lee or Andrew, go ahead and put them in. And towards the end of the hour, I'll come back and be happy to ask any of your questions. But I'll also put a link. We are, as Barbara said, we are getting signed copies of Better Off Dead in about a week or so, I think. And I'll put a link in the comments field should you wish to purchase one.
Let me just add, Patrick, that both authors, Lee and Andrew, are signing our books. And since Lee is in New York at the moment, it might be not this week, but the end of next week before they both get to sign them in Wyoming and ship them to Scottsdale. But so it is in a virtual world, and it's all okay. All right. So Patrick, do you want to show the video of, because it's a really nice introduction to where this book takes place.
Yeah. Can you all see that?
Yep.
Yep.
And there you have it.
Went
So
into- sorry.
thank you, Patrick, very much. So the little town that we're looking at is somewhere in southern Arizona between Douglas on the east and Yuma on the west, but not specified. And in fact, there are a couple of things that are really worth noting. One is that Jack Reacher does not ride into a town on a bus for this book, probably because this little town doesn't have a bus stop. It's not on a bus route. So Andrew could tell us about that. But the other thing I think is really fun is we're not sure what's going on when we start this book with Reacher, and because it's so completely different. When I was talking to John Connolly earlier this week, Lee, he brought up a point which I think is so true, which is basically he says that Jack Reacher has no memory, that every book starts all over again. You designed, I mean, because you've got the benefit of a series character, but every book is a brand new book. And Andrew, while you've had to bone up on the series character, you get to go wherever you want, do whatever you want. So did you design that on purpose, or did it just sort of happen after you wrote Killing Floor?
Well, first of all, let's say that we set it in Arizona because we knew that would guarantee that you would invite us as the first event for the launch. So
It's too modest to say.
it worked. It worked. And yeah, for really everything I do as a writer is based on how I felt as a reader. And I felt if you pick up a series book, the 8th or the 10th or the 14th or something in a series, in one sense, you've got a guarantee that it's going to be okay because otherwise it wouldn't have endured that long. But on the other hand, you've got a rather awkward entree into somebody else's world. And I didn't really love the kind of series that depends on an awful lot of back reference. I really hated it when one character would say to the other, "Oh, do you remember that affair at the Poison Pen 8 years ago?" As if it was significant somehow to the backstory. And because I hadn't read that book yet, I wasn't in the world yet, and I would feel a little excluded possibly. And so I wanted it to be, I mean, not really for any psychological reason, the man with no memory, but I just wanted to, as you said, have it both ways. The appeal of a returning character, but no obligation on the reader to know anything about it. The character is the only repeating one, really, apart from a couple of minor characters. He's the only one that ever repeats. He explains himself as he goes along, and you do not need to know anything about what's happened in the series before, which I think is a fundamentally welcoming thing for readers rather than alienating. Plus, it also characterizes Reacher. He is not interested in what happened yesterday. It's all about today and maybe a little bit about tomorrow for him. He's not the sort of person who's going to reminisce with a buddy about an old case. And so I thought it was consonant, the character and the appeal for the reader would work better that way. I really did not want people to think, oh, I better start at the beginning of the series. I wanted them to launch in and jump in anywhere they wanted.
So basically, for those of you watching, if you've never read a Reacher, you can start with Better Off Dead. But Andrew, since this is the second one that you have written, was it better or worse for you not to have Reacher have a memory?
Well, I think the most important part in terms of setting out to tell another Reacher story is that you've got complete freedom. You're not tied to any given location, and you're not tied to any given job. You know, if he was a sheriff in Laramie, Wyoming, then every single book would have to start with some crime connected to Laramie, Wyoming. So, you know, you're automatically hemmed in. What I love about the Reacher series is that he can be anywhere, and the thing that he's dealing with, the bad guy's plot, you know, whatever it is that's going on that he has to unravel and put right, it can be absolutely anything. And I think that was lovely when I was just a reader. It was lovely to wonder, well, what's it going to be this time? You know, where is it going to be, and what is he going to get involved with? And, you know, it turned out it's exactly the same when I'm on the other side of the desk, because when we sit down on the 1st of September with a blank computer screen, we've got that same choice. You know, we can pick, well, where is he going to be? He can be wherever we want. And what is he going to get involved with? And that was one of the things that was the most fun about this particular book, because we had zero preconceptions. We had no boxes that we felt we had to tick. We just said, let's tell a story that just is really fun to tell. And we had a blast doing it. And I think that comes from the fact that he isn't rooted in that way, and he isn't tied into this preconceived structure.
Well, a toast to both of you on what's the eve of publication. So BYOB is the name of our game anyway. Yeah. So Andrew, did you engineer Reacher's arrival in this little town in Arizona? Because it isn't the way he normally gets anywhere.
Well, you know, I did. And this is a funny thing, actually, because the books, you know, the writing process started out in a particular way. And I hadn't actually appreciated at the time how it would seem to Lee. It turned out that, you know, because what happened was I came up with an idea. And a lot of ideas, you know, when you first think of them and they only exist in your head, they're very delicate, you know, they're very kind of that you just blow on them and they disappear. So I didn't really want to tell him about this idea, because I felt that if I opened my mouth, it would just all dissolve and blow away. So I thought, what I'll do is I'll just play around with it. I'll put it on the page and I'll see if it works. And so I came up with the idea for the first chapter, which actually isn't quite what you were asking, because it's not really how we got to the town. We had to come onto that part second. So I came up with the idea for the beginning. At first, I thought it might be too kind of outrageous, but I thought, well, let's give it a go. Let's see what happens. So I wrote it and I liked it. So then I sent it to Lee to see what he thought. And of course, it came as a total surprise to him, because he didn't know that I'd been working on it or what I'd been doing. So I don't know, Lee, if you want to pick that up, because I'm sorry if that kind of sprung out of the ether at you.
Well, it was great for me because, yeah, you know, we were facing starting again, which is actually a great feeling. You know, the blank screen, a lot of people hate staring at the blank screen. I love it. I love the blank screen because you finished one book a few months ago. And what I've found in my career is that, you know, I'm proud of all the books that I did my best with all of them, but no book ever turns out to be as good as you hoped it might. And so the blank screen is a marvelous occasion. You have not screwed it up yet. This could be the perfect book. And I love that feeling. But I was in Colorado, in my house in Colorado, which you've seen on Zoom, I think the last time, with all the guitars on the wall downstairs. And I was in there just hanging out, and my phone beeped, and it was the email from Andrew with this first chapter. And now I completely see what he was doing. Yeah, it was a risky idea. Could it be gotten on the page in a survivable form? You had to try it. You had to put it down to see if it would work. And it had worked. So he sent it to me. And so from my point of view, it felt like he'd kind of done it in secret. Now I can see that he was road testing it. But he sent it to me, and it is a great opening. I mean, it really is. It is it's a previously I've liked a few of my openings. Persuader, I thought was a great opening, and this one is even more radical than Persuader. And so I read it and I thought, wow, this is going to kill people dead. I knew what the reaction was going to be to that first chapter, and it was a gift, because then we had the mood, we had the tone, we had the substance. It was then a question of kind of reverse engineering what could have produced that particular chapter. And so it was not only a joy to be carrying on, it was easier because we had this fantastic start. And the start in any book is so vital, especially these days. I mean, I remember being younger, there was a book called Captain Corelli's Mandolin. Do you remember that book?
Yeah.
Really popular book, did really, really well. But the buzz on the street about that book was, you got to give it 50 pages, which was kind of true. It was a difficult first 50 pages, and then it was a great book. These days, nobody gives you 50 pages. They don't even give you 50 lines. You've got to get them, you know, in the first paragraph. You got to grab them, and you got to, and then not let them go. So the opening is super important, and it was brilliant. And therefore, my feeling was, this is great. You know, it's like running 100 meters, but you're starting at 90 meters. And so, yeah, brilliant.
Well, from a man who wrote Persuader, which is a book that I give people if they want to learn to write. But I mean, it's one of the truly great opening. I mean, it would have been terrible if you hadn't liked Andrew's attempt at it. Boo.
Yeah, we had I mean, the whole thing has been fraught from that point of view. I mean, it always has been for 25 years, because when I first wrote Killing Floor, you know, which you mentioned, you know, you're nervous about it. You have no idea. And obviously, eventually the editor is going to tell you, or eventually the readers are going to vote thumbs up or thumbs down. But you want to know earlier. So as soon as I'd done that basically first draft, really, I sent it to Andrew, because he was the only guy that I really knew who was reading the kind of same stuff that I was in the same way that I was. In other words, he would be a good judge for this. So I sent it to him, and that put the ball in his court then. You know, suppose he hadn't liked that, you know, what was he going to say? So all along, actually, for 25 years, we've been in this situation where we're nervous about what each other's going to think, you know. And as you say, he did 9 books for himself. And obviously, I read them all early. And the same thing applied in reverse. He was probably nervous about what I was going to say.
Yeah, and the sibling thing, you know, there's a certain latent sibling thing goes on that probably up the stakes slightly. So Andrew, you had this great opening, which unfortunately we can't talk about, boo. And well, we can't, you know, I mean, now we've catalyzed everybody, but that's all we can do. And you've decided on this little town in Arizona, and you've got Reacher longing to see the Pacific, and presumably from San Diego. So how does he wend his way along?
Well, what was happening, it kind of leads on really from the Sentinel. You know, the Sentinel had left Nashville, and he was deciding where to go next. And in typical Reacher fashion, all that happened was that he saw these weird birds flying along, and just for a moment, he thought they were pelicans. And so that put him in mind of Alcatraz. So he just took it into his head, right, I'm going to go to the West Coast. So he's making his way to the West Coast, and you know, there's a couple of incidents along the way, and he winds up getting a ride from a guy. He's hitchhiking in Texas, gets picked up by somebody, and circumstances dictate that this guy, who is heading west initially, he has to turn around and go back east again. And you know, there's no trouble, there's no conflict. Reacher could have stayed in the car with him, but you know, he doesn't like to turn around. He's heading west. That's the way he's going to go. And if the car is turning back, then that means he gets out and walks. And so he's walking along, looking to hitch another ride, and he sees this really incredibly ornate, almost like a kind of obelisk, a statue at the side of the road pointing to this particular town. You know, something that was a relic of the WPA. You know, they came to this town, they did all kinds of work there, including, you know, building this very ornate sign. So Reacher sees this sign and he thinks, well, if the sign is that fancy, what's the town going to be like? Now, it turns out not so fancy, but he doesn't know at this point. So he just heads out across the desert, walking to the town. And he comes across a Jeep that's crashed into a tree. In fact, it's the only tree for miles around. And so he sees somebody who's the driver of the Jeep, feels like he should check, make sure she's okay. And things take a turn from there.
So my point was that I don't think that your opening would have worked if Reacher had arrived on a Greyhound bus, you know,
No.
in this little tiny town. So I love the way that he's walking along, and there we go.
Yeah, and I loved how visual it was. The detail about it being the only tree is perfect because, you know, if you saw that tableau in front of you, the only tree, you would definitely want a car crashed into it with a body splayed across the wheel. You know, perfect. It's a perfect Reacher beginning. And this, I guess it's because of the buildup in the previous books, but there's an ominous drumbeat. You know that. This is not somebody who's had a flat tire by accident. You know this is going to be worse than that. And I love that about the minimalism of the Reacher openings, is that they're always accompanied by this doomy drumbeat of peril. And I think, you know, because I was in the position of reading it this time, yeah, it's great. You can't resist it. You've got to carry on reading.
One of the great things about Reacher is that he doesn't arrive with a mission. He shows up and something happens, and because of who he is, the size that he is, the training that he's had, and all, he stumbles into it. Is it the third book where he's walking along the street and some guy stumbles out of a dry cleaning shop and that kicks the whole thing off, or is that the second book?
Second book, yeah. I mean, I love the small inciting incidents, like the midnight line. He sees a ring in a pawn shop, and that is the entire book right there. So yeah, it's about sliding into the story, and both Andrew and I are we're sort of allergic to the big, huge, you know, symphonic, dramatic openings. You know, where there's a headline in the paper, 10 nuclear weapons stolen or something. You know, that stuff is too big. What we're looking for is more human stories. And Andrew's really good at that, actually, probably better than I am, because especially the minor characters, are a little more subtle than mine were. And in fact, Reacher's reaction at the beginning is subtle in this book, because you said he doesn't have a mission. And that's absolutely true. He's not looking to save the world. He's looking to get to the West Coast and be left alone. But this incident happens, this scenario exists, but he's really suspicious about it. He thinks it's phony, he thinks it's nonsense, and he's trying to just get out of there as fast as possible.
Well, you wouldn't want to waste the tree, especially in southern Arizona, Andrew, where they're probably holding 6 of. Thank you for not making it a saguaro. I really do appreciate you didn't do that. But you raised another point, which I think is worth pursuing, Andrew, which is that you point out that there are not gaps of years and so forth between the Reacher books. In fact, that he's just, you know, cleaned things up in Tennessee and decides on a whim that he's going to head west. So basically, Reacher's ageless, isn't he? I mean, we know that he retired from the military. We know he gets, you know, a pension that sort of allows him to buy the odd toothbrush when he needs to, and a free shirt such as you were wearing. Yes, I know. I love your free shirt. It's so funny. You could tell us about that. But, you know, it's interesting that Reacher and fans go along with it. Reacher basically is going to stay whatever age it was when it started, practically forever. Do you find that true, or are you going to keep him that way?
Well, I think that it has to be, really, because you know, when you're dealing with a series character that's existed as long as Reacher, you know, aging is a fact. The passage of time is a fact. So you can either go with it. You can say, okay, Reacher, you know, it's not hard to do the math to figure out how old he is. And if you keep going and you assume that each story is another year later, you know, what do we want out of Reacher? Do we want to see Reacher in an old people's home? Do we want to see him shuffling around on a walking frame? You know, I don't think that's very fun. I think that a better way of approaching it is to say that Reacher really, at his heart, you know, the essence of his character is timeless. You know, he is a knight errant. He's part of a tradition that goes back thousands of years to the very beginnings of humans telling stories to one another. And so it's really taking that essence and it's moving it into a contemporary setting that gives him his vibrancy. And so my view is that that's the way that we approach it, and that's the way we continue to approach it for as long as people want to read about him.
So Andrew, you're interested in technology. You come from a technology background, so to speak. But Reacher is certainly not, you know, hell, he doesn't even have a cell phone, right? So how are you going to deal with that as the world grows more technical?
You know, that's a very good question. And I think that, well, you know, I think that the key to that question, it's not so much that Reacher doesn't understand technology, because Reacher's a smart guy. We know that from the prequels, we know that he used all kinds of equipment when he was in the army. We know from Persuader that you mentioned, you know, Persuader, he has a hidden device that sends emails, you know. So, you know, he can use technology. So the thing with Reacher is not so much that he doesn't understand the technology, he doesn't understand why people are interested in the technology. You know, why would you want to be texting 24 hours a day? Why would you want to be phoning somebody that you only just had a coffee with? You know, it's more a question of that, you know, it shows the way that he's set apart from the world, because it's the people and their use of technology that he doesn't get. You know, if it was necessary for him to use a computer or to use a satellite phone or something, then he certainly would. You know, he takes the bus, he doesn't insist on walking. You know, he's a rational person. And if he can see that there is a benefit to be gained from using a particular kind of technology, then he would do it. But it's more that he looks at people addicted to all of these machines and all of this frou-frou, and he just doesn't understand why they would want to do it.
Well, Lee, I've asked enough questions. What would you like to ask or say, as the case may be?
Well, I think it's a good point about the technology, because as a writer, I've always felt that the reader appreciates it if the character is slightly behind the curve with technology, because it means that the reader does not feel inadequate compared to the characters in the book. So they find that quite reassuring. And I use it a little bit as a characterization thing. I can't remember which book it is, but one of the books, somebody says, "Why don't you have a cell phone?" And he thinks a minute and says, "Who would I call? Who would call me?" You know, it's just about being isolated and lonely. So in a way, it was a character device as well. And it was my own nature. I mean, I'm hopeless with technology, completely hopeless. I've done millions of these Zooms in the last year and a half, obviously, and with a lot of my friends and colleagues. And I've noticed that a lot of them have got like entire studios set up in their house, you know, with proper professional microphones and locked off high definition cameras and lighting and all that kind of thing. I'm talking to a laptop here that is propped up on 4 rolls of paper towels. That's how technological I am. And so in a way, I was handicapping Reacher. I thought it was a good thing that he wasn't totally technological. But I was handicapping him further to the point where it was getting a bit grotesque, really. So that is the one conversation that Andrew and I had in terms of strategy when we started out with the collaboration last year with the Sentinel. We said we needed a story that, without being in your face about it, did move Reacher slightly into the 21st century, when it came to familiarity with technology. So Andrew invented the plot last year for the Sentinel, which was all about cybercrime and servers, you know, the physical nature of servers. I don't even know what they are. And so it had to be tackled really in that first book. And I think that we did it pretty well, so that we felt no pressure for Better Off Dead to to develop the technology thing. It was done. You know, we felt we did it last year. Now he's just going to get around. And of course, it is 2021. And so he does use a cell phone in Better Off Dead. I mean, not his own, obviously, because he hasn't got one, but he knows how to use it. He knows what it's for. But I did want that poignancy in the backstory where he doesn't have one because he feels there is nobody who would want to call him.
Andrew?
Yeah, I think that's, you know, really does cut, you know, the technology really is a kind of lightning rod that cuts to the essence of Reacher. And, you know, there's a kind of parallel in the sense that, you know, Lee spent all those years in television, right? Television involves all kinds of technology itself, you know, the cameras, the broadcasting equipment, all of that stuff. And so if you're in television, you can either focus on that technology. You can wonder about, you know, how many gigahertz or how many cycles the display monitors use. You can debate, should you have Betamax tape or VHS tape, all of those things. Or you can focus to the programs that you make. And I think that, you know, there's a parallel there with Reacher. It's not about the specifics of the technology. It's about where is his focus? What does he care about? And as Lee was saying, what is he frightened of? And what makes him uncomfortable? And, you know, the idea that he recognizes that he doesn't have a huge number of people that would be trying to call him, but, you know, if he probably would run away from a cell phone even faster if he thought that it would be ringing every 10 minutes because he wouldn't want people bothering him.
Yeah, that is such a key characteristic of Reacher, that he thoroughly enjoys his solitude, but he is simultaneously worried about being lonely. And I think that tension is absolutely central to his character, and it's illustrated by that. I mean, yeah, he would hate it if people were constantly texting him, but at the same time, he feels a little sad that there isn't anybody who would be.
But at the same time, he doesn't hesitate to step into people's lives when he sees a need to do it, as he does in this book, and as he did particularly in the book I was mentioning, where, you know, he's walking down the street and people erupt out of a store, and there he is. You know, he doesn't hesitate to act, does he?
He doesn't, and part of that is because of the noblesse oblige and the problem-solving impulse that he has, but also part of it is for the simple connection. You know, he's eager to get involved with somebody in that situation because it means for a few days he's not alone.
I think for a reader too, it's comforting to think that maybe there is some sort of superhero out there who, you know, in moments of extremity in your life might suddenly fall off a bus, and there he is, you know.
Yeah, I mean,
it's almost the Marvel Universe thing, kind of, you know.
It's 100% of the appeal, and it always has been for thousands of years. People want this character to exist. There would be nothing better than somebody coming up to you, solving your problems, and then leaving. It's such a universal paradigm that that is, you know, 100% of his appeal. People either want that character to exist or they want to be that character, and it's been road tested for, I don't know, 5,000 years or more. We've talked about Shane. We've talked about, you can go back into the Middle Ages. You can go back beyond that into, you know, Scandinavian stuff, Anglo-Saxon stuff. You could go right back to the ancient Greeks. You see it in religious myths. You know, the appearance of a savior is what people want.
Well, Andrew, when I saw that this was going to take place in a small Arizona town near the border, I was really hoping this wasn't going to be a book about immigration and all of that. And thank you for not making it one. But I think this is a story that could only take place in a very small town, don't you? I mean, there's no way this would work in an urban environment.
Absolutely. And, you know, that's part of the thing that we try to nail first when we're talking about a new book, is that you've got to get that tone. You know, you've got to get, what is this book going to feel like? You know, if it was a piece of music, it would be, what key is it going to be in? And so the feeling that we had, yeah, absolutely had to be a small, sleepy backwater town, but something that concealed secrets. You know, clearly almost from minute one, you're thinking, okay, so there's a little more to this than meets the eye. What might that be? How are we going to find out? So those two things combined, the kind of, the sense, the feel, the mood on the one hand, and the sense that there's something hidden beneath the surface that we need to dig into on the other hand. So, that was a critical part of really just set, the preparatory work that we do is just deciding how we want the book to feel, and that all stemmed from there.
So a great thriller needs a wonderful hero, but a great thriller also needs a really worthy villain, a really uber villain. And which one of you named this guy? Because, I have to say that I really had to think about it. What's his name and where did he come from?
The villain is a huge decision. I mean, we've already got Reacher, we know that, given quantity. So really the only decision is the villain. And it's so hard to pitch the villain at a comfortable level. We don't want, a James Bond villain in a stark white underground lair stroking a pussycat or whatever. We don't want that sort of thing. And I think what I learned to do, and clearly you can tell from Andrew's previous books, he does the same, is I just hate certain kinds of people. Smug people, bullies, patronizing people, people who think they're better than me, people who think they can tell me what to do. A person like that is not a huge, gigantic villain. He's not going to be in a James Bond movie, but he's just awful. And if I meet a real person like that in real life, I will defeat him. If it takes me the rest of my life, I will beat him. And there's only one person in the universe worse than me for that, and that's Andrew. It's not a question of the rest of his life. Andrew would invent a way of living to 150 if he had to beat that person. And so what we try and pick is somebody who just triggers us on that level. If you are on the sidewalk outside a bar, who would you hit? That kind of a person. That's the sort of person that we want as the villain. And so this one is perfect, fits that bill entirely. And the name, I'll let Andrew tell you about the name, even though it is part of a tradition that's been going on for a long time.
Yeah, well, the name actually, we have a tradition that, because we're both from Birmingham, we both support Aston Villa Football Club. So what we will tend to do is the heroes will have, or the good characters are going to be named after Villa players. So a good example in this book, there's the medical examiner, Dr. Houllier, the previous manager of Aston Villa, Gerard Houllier. He died while we were in the process of writing the book, and by all accounts, he was a really nice gentleman. So we decided to, have a character for him. And yeah, Den Donker, the villain, he was a player who plays for a rival football team that had just, I think, beaten Villa at one point when we were writing. So I was feeling particularly unhappy about that situation. So it seemed like a really, not only did it have that, the tradition, the football tradition, but I think, a name has to sound right. It's intangible. You can't define it, but, when you hear a name, you just know whether it's a sort of satisfying villain name or not. And I felt like Den Donker was a really, really satisfying name for a bad guy to have.
Yeah, it's almost an onomatopoeic pick. It's the noise he would make when you shove him down the stairs.
Well, vindictive. I love it. I mean, a question often comes up in these conversations about how do you name, or find names for your characters. So you certainly answered that one. So before we call Patrick back, I want to say that oftentimes when we're talking about a collaboration, people want to know which of you wrote what, or, how have you influenced it. I'm going to say, knowing Andrew as well as I do, that what I noticed particularly in this book, Andrew, is that Reacher has really upped his consumption of coffee. I mean, seriously upped it. And I know that's you.
I don't know if you can see my mug here. Look, this is what this is my sort of my goal in life.
Yeah, he's a
I mean,
caffeine psycho,
Reacher
my
was
brother.
a coffee guy, but not to the degree that he is in this book. And, you know, I love that, that you put that in there. But seriously, guys, when you write, do you want to say a few words about how you do it together? Because people are going to ask, so we could just head them off.
Well, you know, what I always say about writing is there's two components to it. There's the delicious part at the beginning where you just lie around on the sofa and daydream, and, you know, constant, complicated, layered game of what if, and you're just making it up. And for a Reacher book which has no plan and no outline ever, that is a process that continues throughout. When I was doing it solo, I'd spend, you know, some time typing, and then I'd go dream up the next part. And the dreaming up is the lovely part. The rest of it is physical labor. It is typing, and it is doing all that stuff that is, you know, saving files, emailing stuff left and right, dealing with promotion and so on. The rest of it is kind of business. The daydreaming part is delightful. And so because of my great age and seniority in the family, I'm doing the daydreaming part. We just talk about, you know, what if this happened? What if that happened? Well, I need to do this. Well, then what about that? And then Andrew types it. So it's absolutely the perfect working relationship for me. How he feels about it, I don't know.
Oh, let's ask him.
Yeah, I think it works out pretty well. Particularly since I've seen Lee's typing, and you know, it's it's a little bit of a painful process. You know, I'd worry about arthritis creeping into the two fingers that he uses. So you know, I think it's probably safer for me to handle that side of things. But you know, it's been, you know, I don't want this to sound too cheesy, but you know, it's just a privilege to get to write books for a living, and even more so, you know, multiplied by 1,000 to get to do it with your big brother. It's just, you know, if somebody had tapped me on the shoulder, you know, you mentioned about what would I think about one day living in Wyoming? Well, you know, years and years ago when I was working in the telecom industry, if somebody had said, you know, in years to come, not only will you get to write books, but you'll get to write them with your brother, I would have thought they were insane. I thought there's no way that I would be that lucky. So the process of working together. Sure, there's the, you know, the late nights typing away, getting everything down on the page, but the process is wonderful, and I wouldn't swap it for anything.
Well, I know that you are, you know, not just there as the file, you know, the typist, so to speak. That would be another whole thing. You know, guys, I ran across two things recently that I've been really thinking about, and I'll throw them out at you, not to comment, but just because I like them. One is Robert Tagoni wrote a wonderful book recently called The World Played Chess. And in it, he says, and makes the point, that it's a privilege to grow old. It's a privilege. It's not a right that anybody has. And those of us who do grow old should feel really privileged. And certainly I do. But the other line that I just ran across, and I'm trying to remember who said it, was that as we age, we either grow into our best or our worst selves. And I thought about that a lot. You know, have I grown into my best self? I'm certainly better than I was when I started all, you know, the Poison Pen 32 years ago, and had no idea what I was doing because it was never intended to be a business. It was just going to be for fun. You know, I like to think that I'm better. What do you guys think about either of those? I think they're marvelous comments.
They are, and obviously this is something that is facing me at the moment, the concept of age, because, you know, significant decade for me. I've been getting the frozen remnant of my television pension. I'm getting that. I just signed up for my British UK pension, which, you know, I paid for with the first half of my career. I'm on Medicare. I'm an old person. And am I the best? Am I growing to be the worst or the best? I don't know. I'm trying to be, the whole thing about the collaboration with Andrew, you know, the transition was that I, at the beginning, again, like I said before, I base everything as a writer on how I felt as a reader. And as a reader, I came across too many series. I mean, not so much these days, but in the past, too many series that were great for 6 or 8 books and then awful thereafter when the author got bored or lazy or just ran out of gas. So when I started out doing it, I promised myself I would never do that. I would never, ever phone it in. And I never have, and I'm proud of that. The 24 books I did on my own were all as good as I could possibly make them. But I was getting older and older, and I did feel, yeah, pretty soon I'm going to run out of gas. Maybe not next year, maybe not even the year after, but sooner or later I will run out of gas. And I am not going to give the readers, an inferior phoned-in product. So that was the motivation behind the transition. So I would say I'm not one of those people that forgets an earlier promise just because it's inconvenient. I stuck to it. So I hope at least, I'm not saying I'm turning into the best version of me, but at least I'm honest about it.
Well, or you're getting better. I mean, you don't necessarily have to be best, but maybe it's on an up curve. Andrew, you're just a baby compared to me, and almost one compared to your brother. So these are probably thoughts that haven't yet occurred to you. But just as an outsider, what would you say?
Yeah, I mean, I really love the sentiment, particularly. I guess the only, the sentiment of becoming either your better or worse self. I would like to think there's a little more sort of self-will involved in that it's not kind of predestined, that you just might happen to wind up being worse, and there's nothing you can do about it. I think that it's something to aspire to, that when I've always had this strange picture in my head of getting to the end of my days and looking back over my life. And one thing that really drives me is that I never want to get to the end of my days and look back and think that I missed an opportunity or that I didn't try hard enough at something. In fact, that's one reason I became an author, was that somebody said to me once that the 2 saddest words in the English language are "what if." And I never want to get to the end and look back and say, well, what if? What if I'd tried this? What if I'd done that? And so I think that, you by asking yourself these kind of questions, you can hopefully steer yourself to the better result rather than the worse. And I think part of it is also just accepting yourself a little bit more. I think when I was younger, there would be things that I wasn't very good at, and I would beat myself up over them. I would think, I should be better at, dealing with my bosses at work or something like that. And I just wasn't. And so for many years, I think, oh, that must be some horrible character weakness. But over time, you just think, well, no, that's just the way I am. That's the hand I was dealt. So that's just the way it's going to be. And I think that acceptance of who you are really helps, because then it frees up your mind and frees up your will, and you can hopefully steer yourself in a better direction than a worse one.
I think implicit in that we either become our best or worst selves was self-will. I mean, I think, it wasn't like it was going to happen to you. You had to make it happen, for sure. And I agree with you. I think part of it is you have to learn to forgive yourself for the stuff that, you could have done differently. That helps a lot. And I brought it up because I thought it was an interesting contrast into what we said about Reacher, that he's always, he's ageless. He has no memory. He can always be, he basically can reinvent himself within the confines of the way you set him up in every book. He can always choose to do whatever it is he wants to do.
Yeah, and then some of them are prequels, the novels, some of the novels themselves and some of the short stories. And I did enjoy doing those for the opportunity to make him slightly younger, slightly dumber, slightly more naive, maybe slightly more optimistic, maybe the sort of things that you feel 10 or 20 years ago. So I did enjoy that, the sense of, yeah, he never changes in the present day, but he had a previous life. And the 2 things sort of go together. The aging thing, yeah, hopefully he'll carry on for many years. And so we're not going to mention a chronological age. We just keep him as a symbol, really, a symbol of agelessness. But because, we've all read series where actually if you sat down and worked it out, the guy would be about 110, but you don't really notice that.
No, Spencer was a Korean War veteran when
Yeah,
we started.
exactly. I was going to say
Here he is.
Spencer, except I
But
thought
you wrote a little volume called Heroes, in which these are questions that you have explored outside of the Reacher series, and so I thought it was worth bringing up. Why don't we call Patrick up and see if we have any questions or comments from the audience while he goes back and forth from YouTube to Facebook.
Yeah, what a great conversation. I like the direction it has taken too. There are several questions. Let's see here. One is for Andrew, which is, Andrew, were you a Jack Reacher reader and fan from the very beginning? We know he's your older brother's character, but did you follow along since the beginning?
Yeah, I absolutely did. I mean, and that was a huge factor when it came to deciding whether to accept Lee's offer to join in with writing the series, because I'm actually the oldest Reacher fan in the world. I was the very first person to read Killing Floor. And, there was such pressure at the time because Lee was out of work. The boot was on the other foot. I had a really good job. I was doing well. Lee was on the dole and he was broke. So when he sent me this manuscript, not only did I run the risk of having to call my big brother and say, sorry, your book is no good, but if I had done, that was supposed to be his meal ticket. That was supposed to put a roof over his head. So I was thinking, well, what am I going to do? Have to send him food parcels? Am I going to have to let him live in my spare room? So, right from the very beginning, I was a Reacher fan. And the thing was, Killing Floor, as I'm sure everyone on the call knows, is written in the first person. So you see everything through Reacher's eyes, you think along with Reacher. But because the way the story unfolds, it's ages before you hear his name. So I remember so clearly thinking, wow, I don't know this character's name, but I know this character. And I knew what he was going to do, how he was going to react. Because, he stemmed from my brother's subconscious and he's a very similar person to me. So over the years, we had so much fun. We would get together, we would hang out, we would go to a football game or a baseball game or a museum or whatever. And we would always be joking, saying, oh, well, what would Reacher do about this? What would Reacher think about that? And he was like an extra brother. He was like an imaginary additional brother that we would joke around with. So it just feels really natural now to be involved in telling his stories.
Vicky asks, although you've been talking about this, she asks, has writing books together brought you together as brothers? And she also says, do you think it has helped to have respect for each other's ideas because of your sibling relationship?
Well, the sibling relationship is different from most people's because altogether there's four of us. Really, there were three boys. I was the middle one. And so the other two were my siblings in that traditional sense of, we were all in the house together at a certain similar age. One of them would be busting my toys, another one would be stealing them or whatever. That was the sibling part. Then Andrew is so much younger that he is obviously identifiably and DNA-wise my sibling, but not in that cultural sense of being annoying. We never lived together under the same roof during those years where we could have squabbled or fought or anything like that. I'd left home years before, Andrew was really a person. And so we are far, far more friends who happen to have the same DNA than siblings. It's such a crucial difference. But if you think about the annoyance and frustration that you've suffered from your own siblings, Andrew and I had none of that. It was all good all the time. And that is really what has made the difference. And it's not a question of getting used to your little brother's opinions and respecting them, because I don't think of him as my little brother. He's a friend of mine, and his opinions are actually pretty good, as good as mine. And so we get along absolutely fine.
You didn't have that sense of sibling rivalry?
Not at all. Not at all. I mean, it was just, we were just so far apart chronologically that there was nothing like that. Not even theoretically, because by the time Andrew for instance, something I did at the age of 12, by the time Andrew got to the age of 12, you couldn't regard it as he did better or worse than I did, because it was a different world by then. You know, he was doing different things.
How about musical tastes? Is there much crossover there?
Yeah, I would say so. I mean, there are marginal differences. You know, it's like a Venn diagram where the middle part is pretty fat. Yeah, but I listen to stuff that he doesn't, and vice versa. But fundamentally, yeah. And that's important for writing. I mean, music is very important for writing. A musical sense, a book is like a piece of music in a lot of ways. And so, you know, you can see from the product that the rhythm is the same, that sort of forward rhythm is there. So yeah, I would say a lot of similarities.
And there's a lot, of course, of music that came out of Birmingham. Do both of you get back there to visit very often?
Let me grab that one, because my daughters still live in England, so I would, before the pandemic anyway, I used to go back a lot. And you know, I had the luck. Well, it depends on how you view it, I guess. I had the experience of going back to Birmingham a lot because I wanted to go and watch the football. I wanted to go to Villa Park and see Aston Villa play, which most of the time was miserable, to be fair. But you know, it's something that you feel drawn to do. So yeah, I would go back to Birmingham a lot. And my younger daughter actually went to university in Birmingham, so she, you know, it was a real almost piece of symmetry, because if I think about all the stories I'd hear from Lee about all of the, you know, the little clubs that he would go to and the up and coming bands that would be playing there, and then all these years later, my daughter was doing the same thing in the same parts of town. It was fabulous, actually.
That's great. Let's see here. Joshua, who is a writer, he says, for Lee, thank you for your epic, iconic body of work. You have deeply influenced my own first novel, which I'm finishing writing now. Who were your influences when you first started writing?
Well, Joshua, good luck, and congratulations on almost finishing it first. And I hope it's great, and I hope it leads to many, many more. My influence, I think, you know, the pretentious answer to that is everything. You know, really, for a writer, as I'm sure you know, everything you read, everything you see can have an influence. But if I isolated it, way back, I would say a Scottish thriller writer called Alistair MacLean, who was a very distinctive stylist and had a very distinctive approach. I loved him as a sort of a young teenager. I guess I read his stuff, but then more
Guns
recently,
Navarone, right?
but yeah, the Guns and
Guns and
Navarone,
Navarone, Ice Station Zebra. I
all of that.
loved Alistair MacLean. I read everything he ever wrote.
Their Secret Ways, one of the great Cold War novels of all time, actually. So he was an influence early, but then the more proximate influence, I would say, John D. MacDonald with the Travis McGee series, which I yield to nobody in my admiration for that series. I think it's just brilliant. And for some reason, it was just a time in my life when I picked up the first one, or the first one I came to, which was actually the last one, you know, apropos what we were saying earlier, and then read them all, 21 of them. And I loved them, obviously, as stories, as novels, as entertainment, as suspense and the thrills and all of that stuff. But I also saw a kind of blueprint. I had this, it was like a commentary track on a DVD playing in my head. I could see what he was doing, and I could see why he was doing it. And that was a huge breakthrough for me. It was like a plan, you know, this is how you do it. And so he was by far the biggest influence. And Travis McGee himself is kind of halfway to Jack Reacher, so it was just pushing it a little bit further. And again, talking about symmetry, a lovely piece of symmetry. A little while ago, I got a phone call from a real estate broker who said that John D. MacDonald's house was for sale in Florida. Would I like to buy it? And I thought, yeah, that's pretty cool. But it was a funny house. It was a house he built on the success that he'd had with his writing. So it was a very nice, beautiful piece of property. But apparently MacDonald was so antisocial, he built that house with one bedroom only so that he would never have visitors.
Could be your writing
Even
retreat. Let's see. Yeah, let me get through some of these other questions. Actually, Jim has a great comment. He says, I'm so glad that Reacher doesn't have the typical geek hacker friend who can get any answer from any server. He says, too easy, too cliche. Good point.
It is a good point, and that is a point that Reacher also has no sidekick. You know, normally the hero has a sidekick, and that is, again, that same kind of dramatic short circuit that I wanted to do without.
We've had a number of people ask, she says, I keep waiting on the Jack Reacher Netflix series to start. Is this ever going to happen? I keep checking. What's going on there?
Well, if you keep checking Netflix, you're not going to find it because it's Amazon Prime. That's what it is. It is absolutely streaming series, but it is on Amazon Prime. And they have finished the first series. As soon as the COVID restrictions abated a little bit, I went to visit the set and I did my cameo. And I have now seen almost all the first season in a sort of rough cutish type of form, and it is fantastic. It is fantastic. Alan Ritchson plays Reacher and absolutely, totally nails it. And I mean, seriously nails it. And this is a very big guy, you know, because I do understand that the book readers didn't love the physicality of Tom Cruise in the movies. So rest assured, Alan Ritchson is enormous. His biceps are bigger than my head. He is perfect for this role. But I mean, it's one of those situations where, yeah, it turned out not only as good as I hoped it would, but actually slightly better, mainly because the first season is Killing Floor, and the actress playing Roscoe is sensational. I mean, she is like the icing on the cake. It is such a powerful pairing there. And yeah, it is brilliant. And I believe, I don't know when it will start. It depends on Amazon dropping it when they think is the correct timing. But my guess is pretty soon in the new year, probably January, something like that.
That's wonderful. You know, and that reminds me of something that I meant to comment on when we were looking at the trailer that your publisher made. You noticed how carefully they didn't show Reacher other than he was kind of a shadow and whatever. When I was talking to NPR today, they asked me about Reacher and whether seeing him through an actor was going to, whether I thought it would affect the way you would write him, you too might write him, or whether readers will react differently to Reacher once they see him personified by an actor.
It's always an interesting question, that, isn't it? And there used to be a kind of rule almost about book jackets that you would never put a face on the book jacket because it would somehow bias the reader into believing this is what the character looked like, whereas it's much better to let the reader invent that for themselves.
Right.
So yeah, you know, seeing an actual physical person playing Reacher is going to be a little probably odd for the first minute or two, but Alan is so right for it that and they've done it so sympathetically and also expensively. I mean, Killing Floor is set in a made-up town in Georgia called Margrave, and they built the entire town on a backlot in order to film it. You know, it's a huge production and really, really good. And I can't wait for people to see it because I think that they're not going to have the doubts that they had about the feature film version.
Well, you know, I remember you saying when that came up some years ago when you were here, somebody asked you about Tom Cruise, and you made a point, Lee, that I never thought about, and which I'll throw out here again, which was at the time that movie was cast, there weren't any tall actors who were box office successes.
That is absolutely right. And that was the key issue because the feature film is financed essentially based on what the money men think of the actor. In other words, the actor has to bring the money. And it does not work like that in television. Now, I'm not saying Alan Richardson is unknown or brand new, but he has got a very short career so far compared to what Tom Cruise had. So he is virtually an unknown for a lot of people. And there's no way he would have been cast in a feature film because where would be the financial backing? But television works differently. You can select an actor based on what you want rather than any other consideration. And he's great. And actually, we did all the screen testing by Zoom, which was very strange, but actually in a way worked very well because it was simply what was on the screen. And this guy is enormous. He has the physicality of Reacher, but he's smart. He had a cerebral quality that I was quite intrigued about. And then when I eventually got to meet the guy and we hung out for a bit and we got to know each other, it turns out that as a teenager and as a young adult, he was a seriously good chess player, like tournament winner here and there. And you can absolutely see that. He's a brute, but he thinks. And that is perfect for Reacher.
I love it, a brute, but he thinks. That's so wonderful. That's been true. I mean, Robert Taylor as Longmire, was not a well-known actor here, but he was absolutely great in Longmire. Sam Heughan in Outlander as Jamie. I mean, who would have guessed? Andrew, are you excited about, the prospect of seeing them come alive on television?
Yeah, I'm very excited, but I've thought all along that the thing is that it's the focus of everybody's ire was Tom Cruise and his size, but for me that wasn't the thing that detracted really from the movies. It was the fact that as a reader, as a Reacher reader first and foremost, what I love and what I've heard so many other people say they love is the way that you think along with Reacher. And if you think about a Reacher book, they're quite long, and trying to condense that down to 90 minutes, you just don't have the chance to see Reacher putting the clues together, making the deductions. And that makes, in the books, one of the most satisfying things is when you have this whole disparate selection of clues. At first, you can't see any pattern to them, and then Reacher helps you to piece them together. That is so satisfying. Can't do that in the movies. It becomes almost cartoonish because, say something's hidden in a room somewhere. In a book, it'll take pages and pages and pages, and you will love the way that you finally work out that it's hidden underneath the third floorboard on the left, In the movies, it's more or less that he has to walk in and say, oh, it's probably under that floorboard. And it's just not exciting. It's not interesting. But because they've got the luxury, and the other thing that was so true about if you rewound time to when the movie deals were happening, there actually not only were there no tall actors, there was no streaming television either. So it wasn't as if there was a choice of media. It was just movies or nothing really. But now with the TV, the streaming, where you can have an entire season devoted to a single novel, that is what I'm excited about. I'm excited about watching it build and develop and grow organically in the same way that it does in the books. And I think it's just going to be so much more satisfying, and I can't wait. I haven't got to see any of them yet, so I cannot wait until they hit the screen. I think it's going to be fantastic.
Certainly, it's one of the few benefits of the pandemic and Zoom and people staying at home is that streaming television has, come into its own. And you're so right. It's so much better for developing a book. Ian Rankin and I once had this conversation about the TV adaptations of Rebus, where a whole book was the single hour or whatever it is. And Ian said that he really wanted to buy them back and have them remade, but I don't know that he's ever gotten around to it, but definitely felt that you couldn't do justice to one of his books in, however many minutes of television you wound up getting. So it isn't just film, it was TV too, was too short. So the whole
I'm really happy with the format. It is, and you're right about, we've all watched a lot of streaming television, and I've watched a lot, which is unusual for me because having worked in television, it's not something that I necessarily want to consume it for leisure because I can see the joins, I can see what they're doing, and it's not exciting. But this series has that kind of narcotic, compulsive quality that great streaming TV has. I mean, I know the story, I wrote it, but I was desperate for them to send me the next episode.
That's wonderful. You've been watching Line of Duty?
No, I haven't.
I'm not entirely sure how I feel about the writing, but I will tell you it is truly addictive. You know, when you start one, you absolutely, it's wonderful that with Amazon, they tend to put them all up at the same time. So when they do put the Reacher up, you won't have to wait till next Tuesday and next Tuesday and next Tuesday, which could drive you mad. You know, it'll be like Agatha Christie, who wrote short books so you could read the book between dinner and bedtime and not lose track of the plot. So it's kind of the same idea. Patrick, are there other questions?
Yeah, there are a few more. I'm going to transfer over to YouTube here and ask some of these questions. But actually, Lee, I wanted to ask you really quickly. I'm sure people have brought this up before, but were the wonderful short novels by Richard Stark, Donald Westlake as Richard Stark, were they influential to you at all? I know that he's a different type of character. He's more of an anti-hero.
Yeah, I love those books. And he had a way with opening lines. I mean, I can't remember the title of the book, but there's a great opening line that said, when the phone rang, Parker was in the garage strangling a man.
Yeah.
You know, how are you not going to read on?
Right. And I think of those actors from an earlier era that have such presence, you know, and just what you're talking about, like, you know, Lee Marvin or Robert Ryan would make excellent Jack Reachers, wouldn't they?
Well, the Lee Marvin generation, that's really significant. There's a great book by David Mamet. You know, Mamet is crazy now, but in the old days, he was a perceptive thinker, and he has this book called Bambi versus Godzilla, which is his thoughts on screenwriting. And he mentions that generation, Gene Hackman, Lee Marvin, those people. They had been drafted, obviously, I think both into the Marine Corps in the early 50s, you know, because that was the situation. And so these were not callow youths, you know, these were not neophytes. These were grown men out of the Marine Corps, going to acting school, looking for a career. And Mamet's point was that fiction, he's talking about the movies, but we can talk about the TV or books exactly the same. He says it's a psychological transaction. The main character steps onto the page and says, "Hi, I'm the main character." And the reader says, "Are we going to like you?" And the worst possible answer is yes, and I'll tell you why. That's the worst possible answer. The best possible answer, are we going to like you? The character says, "I don't know, and I don't care." And that's what I try to bring to Reacher.
Wow, great. Let's see, in another direction, somebody on YouTube asks, one of the things I enjoy about all the Reacher books is the analytical tidbits, his arm length, the speed of his swing, the pounds per square inch of force exerted when his fist connects, etc. Do you have to do research into that sort of information, or is your brain just naturally wired that way?
I think naturally, yeah, and I think Andrew would probably say the same. I mean, we come from Birmingham, which was a manufacturing city where the currency of everything was how were things made. And so, yeah, I'm always fascinated. How do things work? Machines, guns, how do they work? How does the human body work? And how does psychology work? All this sort of stuff. So it's something that I think about all the time. I mean, it's just meat and drink. And so the research, I have never sat down to figure out, you know, what was Muhammad Ali's hand speed? It's just something, you know, you've picked it up somewhere. And so the process of research for me is never contemporary. It's never today, or, you know, I've got to find it out this week. It's something that I learned last year and has percolated a little bit, fascinated me a little bit, and is ready to use.
Wow.
Andrew, do you
Yeah.
have some?
I think that's exactly right. I mean, the thing with, there are certain specific facts that you might have to research, but research is kind of like winemaking. You know, you can't just squeeze the grapes and put them in a glass because they don't taste right. You know, you have to, you just have to accumulate all of this stuff without really intending to, without any specific intention. And it has to just bubble away at the back of your mind. And then when the time is right, it will come out. And it could be facts, it could be locations, it could be people's characteristics, it could be their names, anything like that. It just is bubbling away, it's fermenting in the back of your mind. And when the time is right, it will come out.
One of the things that the questioner suggests there, I remember in one of the books, Reacher hits somebody in the side of the head rather than full on, and says the human brain is 3 times more vulnerable to sideways impacts than fore and aft impacts, and that's exactly the sort of thing that shows up in the books. And I read that in a completely unconnected thing. It was about when they started introducing side airbags in cars. This big long medical explanation of why, and it stuck with me, and it seemed like a interesting thing and perfect years later probably for that paragraph in the book.
Let's see. Yeah, there was a question. I kind of lost it. Forgive me, whoever asked the question, but the gist of it was, although you both have similar styles of writing styles, were there any real surprises that you both found while collaborating? I think that's the gist.
For me, yeah, the biggest surprise was really actually how wrapped up in the present moment I was, and how Andrew had a longer sense of the series, because really the only identifiable change, I think, is that I had gone down this rabbit hole somehow of making Reacher more and more and more reluctant to say anything. Obviously, Reacher said nothing is the iconic line from the entire series, because he doesn't speak much when he doesn't need to. But for some reason, I'd gotten crazy about that, and to the point where 3 words would have been a long speech for him. And if he recited a haiku, it would sound like a filibuster. And I'd been going down this rabbit hole, whereas Andrew remembered the earlier books, where Reacher actually speaks in whole paragraphs, sometimes half a page. And he is lethal with his words back then in the way that he is physically. And Andrew remembered that and valued it, and said to me, we got to nudge this back towards that style. And I think I listened to him, and I'm glad that we did, because yeah, the older books, Reacher is hilarious sometimes. He's deadly or he's sarcastic, but he can be hilarious when he lets rip verbally. And I'd kind of lost sight of that a little bit. And so that took me by surprise. And I think it's a big bonus, actually.
Andrew, what took you by surprise, if anything?
Well, I mean, for me, it wasn't so much a surprise. I think it was confirmation of things that I'd suspected, but only to discover that the scale of them was even greater than I'd thought. Because, having written my own books for all that time, I specifically wanted them to not sound like my brothers. I wanted them to stand on their own and be distinct. So I had, and in a way, I was forcing myself down a different path there. I think my natural style would be much more similar. So in a way, it was a relief, but it was also quite hard to reverse course after 9 books, 12 years or whatever, suddenly on a dime, switch around. So there was that side of it, but then there was also the fact that Lee is notorious or famous, depending on how you look at it, for not outlining at all. And I was never a crazy outliner. I never had chapter and verse and every scene and every character broken down to the nth degree, but I did like to have some idea of where we were going. So there would be times, particularly in the Sentinel, before I'd kind of learned there would be times when we'd finish a passage or a scene, and we'd decide we were happy with it and it was time to move on. So I'd say, great, well, what happens next? And he would say, well, I don't know. And so, you know, I kind of knew that I would be entering this new territory of lack of outline, lack of plan. So I knew it was coming, but it just hit me harder than I'd expected. So, you know, it was things that I'd semi-seen coming, but the impact of them was just much greater in real life than it had been in my imagination.
Maybe a good final question, or just if Lee could talk a little bit about, I remember once I heard you say, Lee, about, you know, the power of just simple declarative sentences. And can you talk about the prose?
Yeah, I mean, I was, you know, in a technical sense, aware that there's a wide variety of readers, and if you want a big audience, you've got to capture them all. It's a bit like the rings of Saturn. In the center are habitual, expert, committed readers, and then on the extreme margins, there are people that possibly read one book a year, or possibly two on their vacation, and that is all. And those are you've got to satisfy both halves if you possibly can. And so I put a lot of thought into that style. It had to be satisfying for the expert reader. They had to be able to identify it as a style, as a choice, as call it faux naif, or whatever you want to call it, a slightly inarticulate man and his thoughts. But for the readers on the margin who are going to read that one book on their vacation every year, you had to make it clear and easy to follow. And again, based on me as a reader, there's nothing I like less than picking up a book again the next day and you read, you know, Smith said, and you think, who was that guy? Who was Smith? And you have to go back several pages and find out who he was to remind yourself. I wanted to avoid that. So yeah, extreme clarity and repetition of the character description more than the name. I very rarely use names if I don't have to. I'll say the guy in the bar, because then you pick the book up the next day. Yes, said the guy in the bar. You know who that is. You don't have to go back and check. So yeah, I really worked on the clarity of it, and most of all, the propulsion, the rhythm of the sentence. And this is what, you know, Andrew does so well too. And it is something that people, you know, people drive me mad about it. There'll be reviews or critics now and then who say, Lee Child will never win an award for his sentences. Well, excuse me, we're selling millions of copies here for one reason only, that the sentences are constructed to trip people forward. There's a forward-going momentum throughout the entire book so that they finish it, you know, and enjoy it, and it speeds along for them. So yeah, you know, that is, it was about a product that would please people that were habitual readers, but also not alienate people that were diffident readers. And I think I learned that in television. There is no point at all in doing anything unless you consider the audience. The audience comes first, second, and third. It is all about them. It is not about you. You have to serve them. And the only way you can do that in a book is with the literary style. So it is, that's why it is like it is.
You made an interesting little video a while back, Lee, which I caught by chance, in which you pointed out that really a book only exists when it gets into the hands of readers. And I think that that is a very true statement. Every single person will read this book differently according to who they are, what their experience is, what their tastes are. You know, that's one of the fascinating things about talking about books, is getting everybody's version of the book. Because the book you publish, you know, is there's always three iterations of a book. There's the book you pointed out earlier, the platonic idea of the book, the perfect book on the blank page. Then there's the book you actually produce. But then the really critical book is the third book, which is the book that each reader reads.
Exactly. It's a
You
Zen
know,
proposition.
it's so different. So speaking of the book that each reader reads, let me reiterate that both authors are very kindly signing our copies, which are a lot actually, of Better Off Dead. But because Lee is not in Wyoming at the moment, there's going to be a little lag before we can ship them to you. So, but the good news is you now have an extra week to order your double signed copy, and then we will mail it out to you. So I want to thank everybody for watching us this evening. We're excited that we're doing YouTube and Facebook. Who knows what other channel or platform we might find? Who can tell? Anyway, Andrew, always a pleasure. And please give our love to your beautiful wife, Tasha. We haven't even talked about you get to actually live with a writer. So you have an ongoing thing in your life that I find absolutely fascinating. I love spending time with both of you, Lee. Always a pleasure. And Lee, I wanted to say is if he can do it, is going to join me on December 1st to talk about a brand new author named Robert Lloyd, who lives in Wales and who has an interesting background. And I don't know if you noticed today that The Bloodless Boy, his book, Lee, is one of Publishers Weekly's 10 best books of the year.
I should hope so, because it is really good. And I really hope I can join him and you, because it's a different book and it's really worth it.
It is a different book. And for those of you who like Ian Pearce, the Instance of the Finger Post, I think that's a fairly good analogy to it. It's interesting to think about medicine when it was in a very experimental stage, sort of like what we're going through today with vaccines and COVID, and people not wanting to take a chance, some of them, on some of the new medical products that were available. But let's not go into politics. Let's instead urge everybody to order a copy of Better Off Dead. And thank you both very much for a wonderful time tonight.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone. Thank you, Patrick, for
Thank
your
you, Patrick.
usual.
It's been wonderful.
Patrick is wonderful. None of this would happen without Patrick. He is the key to this entire thing. So good night, everyone, and thank you.
Good night.
Hello. We hope you're enjoying our programs and podcasts with authors. We'd like to expand them, and your help would be appreciated. Please make a donation at poisonedpenfoundation.org. 100% of the proceeds will go to help connect authors with readers in this difficult time. Thank you.